Hi, I'm Brian Watrous of VMware Education. In this video, we're going to see how to configure input presentation for Orchestrator workflows. This video is one in a series of videos in which we're discussing vCenter Orchestrator. In the preceding video, we discussed a concept known as variable binding. If you have not viewed that session yet, you should go back and view the variable binding video. But in this presentation, we're going to be taking a look at how to configure input presentation. Input presentation allows you to define the layout of your input parameters. As we create more and more complex workflows, our workflows are going to have more and more input parameters, and presenting those parameters to the user in a way that is logical and easier to read is one of the goals of input presentation. But another thing that input parameters do for us is they allow us to perform data validation on those input parameters. That allows us to force the user to do things such as supply mandatory inputs. And additionally, we can force the user to supply values that are actually valid. Input presentation is going to allow us to do all that. So let's take a look at a demonstration and see how we configure input presentation. In this demonstration, I'm going to show you how to configure input presentation. But before I do so, let's motivate why you'd want to do so. I have a workflow here called input presentation, and if I run this workflow, you'll notice that it asks me for a whole bunch of information. It wants to know something about a hobby, a last name, a first name. That's kind of weird. It says last name before first name. This is a lot of information just being tossed up on the screen, and it's probably going to confuse the user. But let me type some values in here. So as you can see here, I've specified, at least best that I can tell, the information that this workflow is asking for. I like traveling, so I put that for my hobby. My last name's Watrous. So I typed in all this information, but notice that I'm apparently not a very cooperative user. I failed to specify anything in this field or this field, and looks like I didn't set a favorite virtual machine, whatever that is. In other words, I'm like a fairly typical user. If the developer doesn't force the user to specify values and doesn't force the user to pick something that's valid, then the user is quite likely just going to input a bunch of unhelpful information. But let's go ahead and go with this information that the user has specified. We'll click Submit, and when we run this workflow, if we look at the logging messages that this workflow produced, it says that Brian Watrous is a technical trainer. That's true. Based in, that's weird. It should say something like California, but it doesn't here. Again, the reason why this is blank here is because we trusted the user to type something, but we didn't force him to type something. The logging messages go on to say he works for VMware. That's true. It says his hobby is travel. That's true. And then it says he's visited null continents. That doesn't make any sense. Well, again, this is, as a developer, I'd have to say this is my own fault, because my workflow should not just ask the user for input parameters, but it should do so in a way that presents the parameters in a visually appealing way to the user. And perhaps more importantly, I need to ask for parameters and do data validation on them to make certain that the input that the user is providing is valid. So that's why we're going to set up input presentation. To do so, I'll select input presentation. That's the name of my workflow. I'm going to edit the workflow. And the first thing I want you to see is that the inputs tab, which is where I created the input parameters, has all the input parameters that we were just prompted for. But notice that the order that these input parameters are listed here in the inputs tab doesn't match the order that we saw when we ran the workflow. The order that the input parameters are displayed when you run the workflow is not controlled by the Inputs tab, but rather controlled by the Presentation tab. So if I go to the Presentation tab, if I wanted the, let's see, if I wanted hobby under the name fields and I wanted last name to come after first name, I can simply drag and drop these input parameters into the order that I want them displayed when the user runs the workflow. But in addition to defining the order here, I can also do things such as creating new steps or new display groups. Now I'm going to keep this simple to start with and simply create a new step. And I'm going to type in the name for this new step. This new step is going to be called Identify, I-D-E-N-T-I-F-I-C-A-T-I-O-N. By the way, I would like to save you a little bit of trouble here. If you click elsewhere, the change that you made, for instance, I typed identification, won't stick. What you need to do instead of clicking elsewhere is to simply hit enter. Now I'm going to set up some additional steps here. In order to save time in the video, we'll cut this part out, but I'll see you here in a moment. Now, as you can see, I've created several new steps. And what I'm able to do with these steps is to organize my input parameters into these different steps. For instance, I'm going to put the first name and last name into the identification step. In other words, when the user runs this workflow, there's going to be a section in the input parameters where it asks for some identifying information. It's going to want to know the user's first name and their last name. Let's see, for location, I'll put state in there. In the location step, we're going to ask the user where he's based out of. Let's see, the next step is employment. So in there, I'll be asking them things such as what their profession is, what company they work for. And then under personal information, we will ask them what their hobby is. Drag that again, ask for the hobby information. And additionally, I have another parameter here. There's no particular relevant motivation behind this parameter. I just simply wanted to have an input parameter that was something other than a string. So here's a parameter that is a number. And again, another parameter that doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense, except that I wanted to illustrate a more complex object. This is an input parameter for a virtual machine. So we'll ask the user to point to your favorite virtual machine. Now, having made these changes, we can now see that the information is going to be grouped in a more logical fashion, and hopefully it'll make more sense to the user. Now, I'm going to save and close, and notice when I do so, I'm receiving a message that the validation of my workflow is not succeeding. If we view the details, you can see that these are simply warnings in this case. You've seen in earlier videos that if this was green, that means your workflow is good. Red means there's a showstopper problem with your workflow. You have to fix it. But these yellow warnings are just that. They're warnings. The warning messages here are complaining about some of the input parameters I'm not actually using anywhere. If we want to, we can click on these quick fix action links to simply delete those parameters, but I'm not going to delete them because perhaps I'll use them later on. I'll go ahead and click close. Again, save and close. Yes, I know there's some warnings in my validation, but I'm going to continue anyways. And now let's run the workflow. This time when we run the workflow, notice that the steps I set up in the input presentation show up here in the input presentation wizard. And we can switch between the different sections by simply clicking on the different steps. Now the user's not overwhelmed with as much information. So now if the user types in their first name and last name and their location and what they do for a living, where they work, and information such as I love to travel, I've been lots of places, and I'm going to skip this virtual machine section for right now, because remember, all I did was define how I wanted the input parameters presented. I haven't said anything about whether or not parameters are mandatory. Notice I'm purposely failing to set this parameter. When I click submit, there's no complaint about that forgotten parameter because the developer didn't say that parameter was mandatory. But if we take a look at the output, if we look at the logs for this execution, we see it says Brian Watrous is a technical trainer based in California. That looks perfect. It says he works for VMware, says his hobby is travel, and he's been to a bunch of places. But our workflow is currently potentially going to allow users to type bogus values or no value at all. So what we're going to do next is go back to the presentation. Go into edit mode first. I'm going to go back to the input presentation section, And we're going to set some properties on the different input parameters. For instance, first name, that parameter is mandatory. The user has to type something there. In order to force them to, I'll click on the Add Property button. First I click on the Properties tab, then I click on Add Property. And there's a bunch of properties I can set on this particular type of variable, including I can specify that it is mandatory. By specifying that the first name parameter is mandatory, actually, hang on a second here, let me make certain. That's mandatory input's a Boolean value. It defaults to no. I need to say, yes, I want this input parameter to be mandatory. Now the user will have to specify a first name. Now again, to save a little time here, I'm going to set all the parameters so that they are mandatory, and I'll be back in a moment. I'm back from having changed all the input parameters to be mandatory. I'm just finishing the last one here. So this virtual machine input parameter is mandatory. Don't forget to specify yes. So now all of these parameters are mandatory. That way, when the user runs the workflow, we're going to force them to supply an answer to each and every one of these input parameters. But mandatory input's only one of numerous properties that you can set on an input parameter. For instance, let's take a look at this numerical input parameter called number of continents. I'm going to add some additional properties. For instance, we can add a property that says the default value for this input parameter is 1. And additionally, we can specify a minimum and maximum number of allowable values that the user can type. So the user is going to have to type something because it's mandatory. We'll help them out by giving them a default value, but if they want to type their own value, they're going to have to type a number between 1 and 7 inclusive. Now we'll come back to this virtual machine. I want to do something interesting to it a little later on, but notice that all I've said for the virtual machine input parameter is that the user has to supply some value. We'll come back and look at that one in more detail, but let's save and close. Again, we're receiving the same warning. We'll go ahead and continue. This time when we run the workflow, again, because of the steps we set up, the user is able to type in information in digestible chunks. So they type in their name, their location, their profession, company they work for. They type in other information such as their travel. And you'll notice that for each of these parameters, there's a red asterisk. That red asterisk indicates that the parameter is mandatory. Now I'm going to purposely forget to, well, notice if I don't type in a value for this mandatory input parameter, I'm immediately warned, not actually warned, I'm stopped completely in my tracks until I fix this error. It tells me that there's an error. The hobby field that I'm in is mandatory, but it's not set. I have to type something there. So that'll stop your user from passing in blank values. And then for the number of continents this guy's visited, again, it's a mandatory field. If he attempts to type something such as, let's see, I've been to 256 continents. Apparently, there's not that many continents, but notice that the data validation that I've set up in my input presentation is stopping the user from typing stupid things like 256 or -1. That's a bogus value too. But if you type something such as 7, then we have supplied valid information. Now, in this last step here, we're asking the user to pick a virtual machine, and we're going to come back to this again in a few moments, but this is the way browsing for objects normally looks. When you browse for an object, you are taken into this tree browser where you drill down into the inventory to find the thing that you're looking for. For instance, I'm going to pick this virtual machine as my favorite virtual machine. This is the tree browsing mode. We're going to see how to switch this into a different mode in a moment. But I've now supplied valid answers to each of the input parameters. If I click Submit, the workflow runs. And notice in my workflow, I don't have to do any coding to check whether or not the user's typing in values or typing in valid values. My input presentation's already doing that data validation. If we look at the logs down below, we see, again, Brian Watrous is a technical trainer based in California. He works for VMware. He loves to travel. He's been to 7 continents. So this all looks like it's working perfectly. But through input presentation, we're able to present the questions to the user in a much more logical and organized fashion. We're able to perform data validation, and we're able to do that data validation without messing up our workflow with a whole bunch of ugly code. Instead, the input presentation is all taking place in that input presentation tab. It's nice and easy to set up, it's quick to set up, and it's very, very clean. Now I'm going to make one more change to my workflow. So I'll select the workflow, I'm going to edit the workflow, and this time we're going to take a look specifically at this VM input parameter. Right now, we can see that I've specified that it is a mandatory input, but I want to be a little fancier. So I'm going to click Add Property. And in Add Property, we have a bunch of properties that we can add, but I'm going to select Value As. As you'll recall from a few moments ago when I ran the workflow, the default way that the user selects a virtual machine is through the tree browser. But I'm going to change, instead of using the tree browser mode, I'm going to choose a list mode. Notice also there's a drop-down mode. We're going to choose list mode. Again, I'll save and close. Again, we get the same warning. Ignoring that warning, if we run this workflow, this time we, again, supply all the information as before. I'm going to go ahead and jump to the virtual machine. Notice now when I click on the virtual machine to set its value, I don't see the tree browser mode, but rather I see a list of, currently a list of 0 virtual machines. The idea behind this list is the user can filter out to see exactly which virtual machine they're looking for. So for instance, if I type 3 and hit enter, it should only show me 3rd virtual machine. Or if you want to see a list of all the virtual machines, you can just leave the filter field blank here, hit enter, and here's all your virtual machines. Pick your favorite virtual machine, select it, fill in the rest of the information for the input parameters, run the workflow, and once again, you prompted the user for all the information in a way that is digestible for them, presenting it to them in digestible chunks. And furthermore, we've ensured that our workflow is going to only receive valid information. Now, in this demonstration, we've shown you various things about how to configure input presentation. There's much more to input presentation that you can do. The input presentation is one of the subjects that we talk about in our training, and you can learn about input presentation through the online documentation. But what we're going to do in the next video is take a look at a concept known as actions. In particular, we're going to learn in the next video how to invoke actions. Thank you for watching this video. Be sure to check out the other videos in this series to learn more about vCenter Orchestrator. For in-depth, hands-on Orchestrator training, enroll in the VMware vCenter Orchestrator Develop Workflows class and connect with other Orchestrator developers online at communities.vmware.com. Thank you.